Hi, this is Mickey and I'm Dan. It's been about 6 months since I got my TIG welder, the ROHR WSME, and I thought maybe it would be interesting to share a few tips or observations, I guess, that I have made as a completely newbie TIG welder in the last 6 months as I've used the tool a little bit. Again, completely newbie, I'm not using it professionally, this is just a hobby. I've made a number of things with it, but I'm far from an experienced person. But I have some observations that perhaps were not obvious to me when I started. Before we get into tips, I should probably share a couple of examples of what I've done with the TIG welder to try and establish that I have actually been able to do useful things with it before I try to opine on any kind of sensibleness. So I guess the easier thing to do was this metal bending setup. This is thick steel, all of these joints pretty easy to make. I fabricated all of these little bits and bobs, all using the TIG welder to join things. And in fact, this, I'll take out the central pivot. This whole piece was me fabricating from a piece of cylinder that I then welded a cap on each end. So the central core is actually, I put wood in there because I wanted it to have some kind of volume, but it might just as well be hollow, to be honest. So this was a successful build. I've used this to bend a few things, and I say thick steel, pretty straightforward. At the more delicate end of the spectrum, I made this playing card case with etched sides. This is slightly less than 1 mil. I think it's like 0.8 mil stainless steel sheet material that I welded all of these edges. Some of them are better than others, but nonetheless, I'm pretty pleased with how this came out. This sits in my bag and protects the deck of cards in a nice way. So just a couple of examples of things that I have made. You can take my tips under advisement based on the things that you've seen that I've made. Tip 1. Yeah, I initially, and in fact if you look at the video when I first got it, I got myself set up to be able to regrind the tips on the tungsten all the time. I did a lot of like, oh god, regrind it. Not so much now. In fact, if you look at the state of this, my goodness, that is a mess and a half. But honestly, for a lot of what I have done in relatively thick steel, you can kind of get away with kind of not worrying so much about it. Now, it's probable that I would get much nicer results, and I'm not saying you shouldn't grind your tips. I'm just saying it's a little bit more forgiving than you might imagine from starting out. Tip 2, and this one I learned relatively early on, and that is always turn off your argon gas cylinder at the cylinder when it's not in use. Now, I didn't really think about this when I first plumbed everything else in. I obviously checked for leaks, made sure I was comfortable that it was not losing pressure, etc. Everything good. I used it over a weekend, and then as hobbyists do, I was busy the following weekend. It was maybe 2 weeks later when I came back, and I had not shut the cylinder off at the valve, and I lost about, I'm going to say 50% maybe of the capacity of the cylinder in that 2 weeks from, I guess, very small amounts of leak. So now I have a very high-tech sign. Arg on, arg off. I try and use this to remind myself to turn off the cylinder before I leave the workshop. Tip 3. and this is maybe should have been obvious, and that is when making a joint like this or like this, kind of where you set up, this is kind of a very scrappy piece, but I think my inclination is to sort of start maybe like this, and then I'm coming around the end and coming towards me, but that's not ideal because you're starting the weld puddle right at the edge of this piece of steel. You know, obviously this is fairly thick, it's fairly forgiving anyway, but on small material it gets more and more of a problem to start the edge. So I've tried to get into the habit of essentially starting with the alignment set up this way, so that I start essentially just off of the join that I'm going to make in the bulk of material here, which can take the heat and start the puddle without causing bleed from the ends, and then walk it into this joint and then along and finish at that kind of edge piece. It's a minor difference, but I think I've had better results from trying to make sure that I start and proceed in those patterns. So here's a little demonstration of what I'm talking about. I've got a relatively thin piece of steel, or at least it's just a flat stock, so there's no meat behind it, and a piece of box section. We're just going to butt join them, and I'm going to start in here and bring it up to this to try and avoid this one thing to just race away and melt away before I've caused the join. It's certainly going to be more important to make sure we have the puddle started on the box section before we get it started over here. That's a pretty ropey looking tip. Let's see how we get on with it. Now, obviously I left a bit of a trail over here where I started, which maybe is undesirable, but I don't care. I used the filler rod just to create this first join, and then I was able to put this down and just walk this along to create this joint. And if we look at the kind of penetration on that, you know, hopefully you can see got a good melt all the way through. It's a good solid joint. I can't physically bend it. That'll do. Tip 4. The function of filler rod. Again, I've seen plenty of videos prior and like people doing the funky feeding thing, and I kind of initially assumed that you needed filler rod a lot. And again, not a professional, probably you do need filler rod, but you can get away without filler rod quite a lot of the time, particularly again in thicker steels. But where filler rod is necessary is really to get you started on those joints. Now I've seen people, you know, tack weld things together, and it seems like they magically press the button and right there, perfect spot weld joins the two things together. I'm here to tell you that that does not seem to happen as often as you might imagine, at least not to me in my setup. And again, I'm often being much more slapdash. I haven't necessarily ground everything super clean, the joints are not necessarily super tight. And so what you tend to find, or what I tend to find, is that when you hit two pieces of steel, they both want to ball up into droplets of steel, but there is a surface tension like water. So you end up with like two droplets sat next to each other that are more inclined to melt back into their own material than they are to connect with each other. This is often the situation you get in with your torch. You've created a melt on each piece of steel, and they may even be touching, but the instinct is actually for the material to almost want to melt away from the join. So really when you're using your filler rod, the first thing you're trying to do is just that. And once they're connected, it's much easier to just walk that melt down the join. These welds, they were not done by adding filler rod. Basically this whole structure I welded by just starting the weld puddle, using the filler rod to break any tension to get the join on the two sides, and then just running the torch steadily along to bring material from both sides to join each other. Tip 5. There is a dial on the side of your welding helmet. It is there for a reason. I feel like this was never quite so obvious to me with MIG welding, but with TIG welding, where I'm certainly tackling a much wider range of materials and thicknesses, and that sort of plays out in the thickness of the tungsten you use, all that kind of stuff, those factors all affect exactly how bright the brightness of the weld is. And that makes a big difference in how well you can see it. And the dial is there so that you can calibrate the amount of darkness so that you can see clearly what you are doing at those varying levels of brightness. Again, that was not really apparent to me to begin with, but pretty much whenever I'm setting up to weld a different kind of material or different thickness, the first thing I'm really doing is kind of just trying to calibrate in how dark do I need the thing, how much power do I need to get the weld, etc. Those things all combine together, and making sure that you can see clearly is very important. And tip 6. You don't need a pedal. I know I've watched a lot of videos, people talking about pedal and pedal control and how they use it to start, all this kind of stuff. Pedals are really expensive, I've looked at them. But again, for my usage, I really haven't used any of the fancier settings. I set my peak voltage high enough to get a puddle started. I set my base voltage around about what seems to work to keep a puddle going in the material I'm working on. That's pretty much it. Not using any of the pulse settings, none of the fancy kind of control of that, up slopes, down slopes. It's a pretty daunting set of things, and I'm sure that in a real world where you were really doing this for kind of commercial purposes, all of that stuff comes into play to make the best possible weld. But for me, as a hobbyist, I've achieved perfectly good, seemingly strong welds with none of those things. So don't be intimidated by slopes and pulses and whether or not you need an extra pedal. You really can get going and make kind of a lot of cool stuff with really only 2 of the controls on your machine. So yeah, that's it. Those are 6 tips, thoughts, ideas that I've had in roughly 6 months since I've been working my TIG welder. Hopefully that's of some interest to somebody, maybe. Anyway, thanks for watching. Catch you next time.